I'm going to mute you all, yes.
Yeah.
Doesn't explain why. Right, so good evening, everybody, and welcome, and especially to some new faces which have joined us this evening. I'm delighted and honoured to welcome Julie Marson, our local Member of Parliament for Hertford and Stortford, as our speaker. I think locally, Julie, I think it's called Stortford and Hertford. Anyway, Julie's going to be talking about this country's recovery post Covid-19 and what role civil society will play in that recovery. Quite a challenging subject, and we look forward to it immensely. But before I invite Julie to speak, could I just remind everyone of the now well-established Zoom rules. Everyone will be muted, as most of you are now, and when invited to speak or ask a question, you'll require to unmute yourselves. I'm guessing there will be a number of questions, so could you message me on the chat box or raise your hand should you have a question, and I will endeavour to involve as many as possible. Now at Stort Valley, it has become a tradition that before the talk begins, we invite Peter Blasco for his words of wisdom. Peter, if you could unmute yourself. And we...
Yes, I've done that. Yes, good evening all. I don't know about words of wisdom, but the thought for today. So let us give thanks for our meeting together. Thanks too for glimpses of fine autumn weather. Covid meant there were few veterans on Armistice Day, but still a moving ceremony as tradition held sway. Now tonight, we are privileged to hear our MP speak on the quirks of Parliament we don't often see.
Thanks very much. Excellent. Right, so I would now like to invite our Member of Parliament to speak. Julie.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you so much. And thank you, Peter. It was actually a very lovely remembrance service on Sunday. It was a real privilege to be a part of it. And the Royal British Legion and the Town Council, I thought, did a brilliant job of managing a very moving, ceremony, even in, really weird circumstances. So I'm glad you mentioned that. It was really important. And thank you, everyone, for having me with you this evening. I'm sorry we still have to do these things over Zoom, really, but it seems to be becoming the new normal, if there's such a thing. And there are positives in it. I mean, in my work, it's been quite productive. I certainly have a big turnover of meetings, which are made more easy with the fact it's Zoom. It's quite a big churn of meetings, which is quite efficient, actually. And also I found, for instance, in Treasury Select Committee, we've had a breadth of witnesses giving evidence and talking to the committee that I don't think we would ever have had before. We had an economist from Australia the other day speaking to us, and we had, for instance, a very, very really interesting witness from the IMF who dialed in from New York. And so it's been interesting to get a perspective that I think, we wouldn't have actually have. So there have been some benefits, but I also completely recognise that, we're social creatures and that we often miss the human interaction. And I know, this whole period is so hard for some people, and I'm sure there's people in the meeting today and this evening that, maybe have had to isolate, have had friends and family have had to isolate, who are missing people. So, but it's very nice that we can do this. And I would actually say that in, should I say, Stortford and Hertford, I've spoken to so many people and so many businesses. It's been amazing how resilient and creative and adaptable people have been to respond to the huge challenges that we've been facing. I've been out on a lot, particularly in Bishop Stortford and Sawbridgeworth. And it's extraordinary, actually, very positive people, businesses, goodwill. And it's not always reflected in the newspapers that way, but I am constantly taken back by the generosity of spirit and goodwill that I find out there, and also the community spirit. And I think the Rotary movement is an absolute epitome of that. In our community, up and down the UK and around the world. And I absolutely pay tribute to everyone involved in the Rotary movement, because it's a hugely positive thing, and actually it plays into what I want to talk about civil society, and I'll come on a little bit later about exactly what I mean about civil society. But I want to talk about COVID and the economic recovery, and how the economy and businesses and civil society all have a part to play, and the relationship between those things, and how they will all interact, and how we can make the most out of every part of those kind of strands to build back better, as the slogan goes, which was actually Joe Biden, I think, pinched that as well. So my belief is underpinned by the belief that we're a great nation, and that we do best when we work together as a nation and as a community. And I think we've certainly seen that since March, from everything from the clap for carers, where the focus was on the absolute heroics that our health service was doing. But also, I think there was a switch as well, whilst we never lose sight of what our health service is doing for us. But I think in the middle of the summer, maybe there was a switch. And you know what, to me, the new heroes as well were the wealth creators, the businessmen, the businesses, the restaurants, the hospitality workers, the accountants, who were actually working, will take us through that next stage of development and recovery, as we recover as a nation and an economy. We can't escape the fact that we can't, make no bones about it. The economy has taken a very, very serious and severe hit. The GDP drop, but there are many different forecasts, but we might expect it to be 11% drop in GDP this year, far greater than we saw in the 28-29 crisis. And frankly, one of the worst in Europe, and one of the worst of the major economies that will be affected by COVID. And there are many reasons for that. The structure of our economy is pertinent in that. One of the things, for example, we have a very service economy driven economy, which dates back from actually what I think is a very positive thing in the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher shifted us away from the old industrialized economy that defined our past and a previous industrial revolution, into that financial services outlook and a service economy, which took us away from being the sick man of Europe into a completely different shift and course for our economy. But of course, a service economy is often more susceptible to shocks like that, and maybe one that relies more on person-to-person contact. And we have been hit hard, and we will continue to be hit hard. So in terms of, on the Treasury Select Committee, we've heard lots of evidence from different economists, and we've heard about U-shaped recoveries and V-shaped recoveries, square root shaped recoveries, double dip recoveries. And we don't know exactly what shape the recovery will be, but I'm naturally an optimistic person, but I do believe that the middle of the summer showed us, when we came out of that first lockdown, that there is a lot of demand there, that we basically, fundamentally, we have a very, very resilient, strong economy, and there is still a lot of demand in that economy, which will allow us to bounce back. Although we can't be sure about when, because it's a health crisis before it's an economic crisis, and we are led by the health imperatives which the economy has to follow. What I do think, apart from being a resilient economy, is one of its positive things is actually, and particularly in Hertford and Stortford and Hertford, is the absolute vitality of small businesses. A lot of the time, large business, major businesses get a lot of the headlines, but actually the absolute backbone of our country and our economy are small and medium-sized businesses. 95% of our businesses are small businesses, and so they are so important, as along with our startup economy, because I think it's so important to continue what we've had for the last 10 to 15 years, which I think is a very, very attractive ecosystem for startups, for new businesses and for small businesses. And I really, really think that's so important. It's going to be a really vital part of our economy. And I think the government has taken that on board. I think they absolutely accept that. And so we've seen in the summer not only huge moves and packages to support existing businesses, quite rightly. We've also seen packages, I'm thinking of something like the £2 billion Future Fund, which is there to support and continue new business support. So it's focused on pre-revenue, so businesses which aren't even earning any money or aren't even earning any profits, to support those businesses which actually will probably be in those sectors of the economy where the most growth can occur. So in green technology, in agribusiness, in fintech, those new, the old oil companies, as it stands, although they're all trying to reshape their business quite rightly, the major growth is not going to come in the big old existing industries. A lot of the new growth is on new technology and new sectors of the economy, which is really exciting. And also, I think, really exciting for Hertford and Stortford and for our local area, because we have the London Stansted Cambridge Innovation Corridor in our area. It roughly follows the M11 between London and Cambridge, as the name would suggest. And we are working very hard, and it's already becoming a very, very important area for startup and innovative industries like life sciences and green energy and so on. And that's really, really exciting, and will be a huge area of wealth creation. I'm privileged to be the vice chair of the all-party parliamentary group for the Innovation Corridor, and I'm working very hard, lobbying the Treasury very hard, along with the people who run the corridor, to get more investment from this government. But it's not just from government, it's getting businesses to invest in that area to make it a really exciting skills cluster, to make businesses from all over the world want to invest in the Innovation Corridor. So there's lots to be positive about our future in that respect, and I do think the government gets it. And also because of an absolute positive energy that we want here, and also yesterday, what fantastic news about the potential for a vaccine and other vaccines, that I really hope that the light at that tunnel will become obvious in the next few weeks and months, and that green shoots with the health crisis and the economic crisis will start to show themselves. So what do I mean by civil society? I talked a little bit about the economy, but what do I talk about? What do I mean when I say civil society? There are various definitions of civil society, but essentially it's not government. Whatever isn't government it can be part of civil society. So it's people, it's communities, it's businesses, and it's charities. Margaret Thatcher once said, in what I consider to be a much maligned quote, really, is that there's no such thing as society. But of course, that's the only bit that people often say. But actually what she said, and I've got the quote in its entirety, is there's no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. And no government can do anything except through people. And people must look after themselves first. It is our duty to look after ourselves, and then also to look after our neighbours. So I think she was trying to encapsulate that idea that of civil society, that we can be responsible for ourselves, but we can also, part of that responsibility is to look after each other. And I think it's true to say that David Cameron tried to encapsulate that in the big society to varying degrees of success. But that's the idea. And what I'm really interested in is how civil society plays a role in our new future, in the new normal, and in our recovery. And so I've been trying to look at that and see what the opportunities are from that, and how we should be facing those questions. And just as an example, I think of young people, and I talk to a lot of schools, and young people don't necessarily take the inspiration and sort of almost deference from the places that maybe we did. You know, that they might not be looking to the current Thatchers or FDRs or Churchills, but they might be looking to other people. For instance, Bill Gates and all of the not only the business success, but what he and Melinda Gates have put into their foundation in eliminating malaria in Africa, for example. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk and his space adventures. So as technology advances and social media brings that technology into people's homes so much more, I think that's changing the dynamics between business and society and the economy. And so I'm really interested in where the power balance lies between those different things, between big business, people, technology. And I think you can compare it to the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 80s even, and say that usually we would always assume that the state was the biggest actor in the world and had the most money and the most influence and the most innovation. But now most of the innovation and a lot of the influence comes from different sectors. It's not the state at all. And there are really big players elsewhere. And I think it's really important to reassess potentially how where governments fit into that, and where business fits into that, and where communities fits into that. And if, again, just to give you an example, there's a lot of companies that have taken a lot of government money. So what's their responsibility now? Where does that leave their part in the community to survive and to prosper? We have given them enormous payments, and there's been some, I think, you know, they reached the headlines, some companies that people consider have reacted well to that, and reacted well and responsibly and in a community-minded way to the crisis. And there are some that haven't. There was, I won't name the company, but there was one company just this week that took £240 million, I think, of taxpayer money, and has, strangely enough, coincidentally, paid away a very similar amount in shareholder dividends. Now, is that right? How should we consider that? How should we respond to that? Should that be the role that business has in the society? Should that be the contribution that they're making? Should we accept that? What are the implications of the way that businesses behave, and is it changing? And now, as a Conservative, with a small c and with a large c, it's not all bad news. I passionately believe that our recovery and, for instance, our reaction to the climate, it will all come from private individuals and businesses, wealth creators, and innovators. That's where change will come from, and that's where recovery will come from. And we need individual drive and innovation and skills and talent to make that happen. So that's a really positive thing. But it does leave that question of what role government should have in that trend and in that effort. And not just that either. One of the interesting questions about the world is about the changes that happen in the world and the economic uncertainty that we face is also how we measure success. Michael Gove gave a speech a while back talking about reevaluating how we define wealth, how we define the health of a nation, the wealth of a nation, because historically it's been judged quite simply on a GDP basis output, but what truly determines recovery, what truly determines success as a nation? Other countries, Finland, Denmark, there's quite a few and increasing numbers, they judge the health of their nation not just on GDP, for example, but on a happiness index. And there are several, but they're tending to coalesce around a more similar index. So could we be looking at a future where we do look more seriously and in more detail about the health of a nation, the mental health of a nation, for example, the lifestyles of a nation as the real barometer of what constitutes a healthy and wealthy nation? And I think these are the type of questions that we need to be asking ourselves. And again, just to give an example about what's currently happening is people working from home more, people who live in Bishop Stortford and used to commute every day but aren't doing that anymore and might be finding a better work-life balance. And do we want to keep that life balance, or do we want to just snap back into the way it was? I don't think we'll end up snapping back into the way it was. There'll probably be a halfway house, I suspect. So I guess I'm interested in the way that, in my position as a politician, and how politics can convene, can bring together people and businesses and progress, and then together where we go. What does the journey look like? How do we intertwine everything to serve a better purpose? Because I don't think that the state can be everything. I don't think it should be everything. But the best we can get is to combine the ingenuity and the potential of every part of our economy and of our nation and of our community to deliver better social outcomes and economic outcomes for the whole of society. And I mean that in every demographic, whether it's white, minority, male, female, north, south, old, young, every permutation that you can think of. And I've been working a little bit, well, quite a lot actually over the last few months in thinking about this. And one area that I've been looking at is what's called social impact bonds. Now, some of you may have heard about them. The word is not a great descriptor, but they're effectively payment by results mechanisms for delivering positive social outcomes, so social services. So it might be delivering probation services, disability services. They can be green technology, for example. So effectively, private sector organisations can invest in these bonds to fix a certain targeted problem, and then they get payback once the agreed outcomes have been achieved. And they have a great potential, I feel, to deliver public services in a different way, in a more efficient way, and I think in a more locally targeted way. And I'm actually working with a think tank. It's Margaret Thatcher and Keith Joseph's think tank, the Centre for Policy Studies. And I'm very excited that we're looking at social impact bonds and the potential use they might have to deliver investment from the private sector with government help, but also delivering fantastic public services. And I think that's part of the innovative way that we should be approaching the future. And I'm not the only person that's looking at this kind of thing. You may have seen Danny Kruger, one of my colleagues in Parliament, who's written a report on civil society and how we can build back better in every way. And it's not just people like me that is looking at that. I think businesses are also increasingly recognising the influence they have on society and also how society influences them. There's another new thing that I think I've never heard of before, that I've only seen quite recently. We've heard of boycotts, where people refuse to buy from companies or countries where their values don't seem to be aligned with our own. But there's a new thing, a new term called a boycott, which is where we actively seek out those companies where we feel that their values and what their purpose is, their social purpose is, aligns to us, so that we might deliberately make a conscious choice to buy from those companies. Or those type of businesses, for instance, maybe we decide to say that we want to buy from the local butcher in Sawbridgeworth rather than go to a supermarket. We might want to shop local, for example, because that means more to us. or we might just look at some of the way that some companies have taken taxpayer money and we might decide that we don't want to buy from them. So that there's boycotts, there's boycotts, but that interaction with people and communities and the mutual reaction we can have with each other, I think can be increasingly important. For instance, we see some companies aligning themselves with certain social sort of trends. You know, you get Ben and Jerry's talking about Black Lives Matter, you get other companies talking about you know, other different social issues. So it's a two-way thing where people are considering where they buy from and why they buy, and equally companies are thinking about the impact and what they want to align with in society, really, and in our communities. So I've raised probably more questions than answers, but what I'm trying to kind of is my thinking really about the changes that we're going through, that we will be out of this health crisis. I'm incredibly optimistic that things are going to be changing soon, and that I'm really incredibly optimistic about our economic recovery. But it may be different. It may be in some ways different to what we've known before, and that we have potentially a chance to shape that. And that if we want change, we need to really be thinking about the interaction between the government, the state, businesses and our communities, because of all things that I think we've learned over the last 6 to 10 months is how amazing our community is, what we can do for each other, and what a difference each individual and each family and each town and each business has and can make on our own community. So if I've helped, I hope I've raised some questions. I don't want to talk forever. I've probably talked longer than I intended to, but I'm very happy to answer any questions about this, or indeed anything else about my work in Parliament, or any issues that you might find interesting. So I hope that was interesting.
Thanks very much, Julie. You've certainly laid down the challenge to us all to actually help get us through this current crisis. Right, questions. Right, Ian Priest has got a question. You need to unmute yourself, Ian. Ian, could you unmute yourself? That's it.
Sorry, unless I missed something, Julie, the one thing you haven't mentioned is the other giant elephant in the room, which of course is Brexit. One of the great white hopes of Brexit was, for instance, a US trade deal. It quickly became apparent that this was going to be trickier than it was first supposed. And it doesn't look like being any easier under a Biden presidency than it might have been under a Trump presidency. And that's leaving aside the specific benefits to Britain that might flow from a US trade deal, which are, as far as I know, pretty well unquantified to date. Australia and New Zealand are much easier to do deals with, but their economies are both tiny and far away, and therefore, for Britain's purposes, not quite irrelevant, but at least of lesser consequence. So my question really is, how would you define, how would you specify the great opportunities and benefits that were said to, particularly for our area, that were said to be on offer from global Britain, and the benefits both to this area and to the country at large of Brexit in general?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I'm incredibly optimistic. I think we will get a trade deal with the European Union. I think, like all of these things, I don't want to sound glib about it, but they do go down to the wire. That's the nature of these beasts, unfortunately. I feel absolutely convinced we will get a trade deal with the EU. And I've always believed it's not a zero-sum game either, that we will, as you say, you know, we've already signed deals with Japan and, you know, Australia and New Zealand, like maybe they are easier. We certainly have a long and deep history and similarities in ethos between us. A US trade deal, I believe, will happen. It might not be President-elect Biden's first priority, but I don't think it would have been potentially most presidents' priorities in terms of he's going to focus on the pandemic that his country is facing. But equally, he's pragmatic. I've got no doubt at all. He's spoken to Boris Johnson today, which is a really positive thing. And whatever noises you hear from governments and people who are playing often to their own domestic audience, I think everyone admits that both sides in every trade deal has a lot to gain. You know, free trade is a fundamental wealth creator for businesses and farmers, for example, in Hertford and Stortford, to allow them to export as much as they possibly have fantastic produce as they can. Will be a positive thing. I mean, you know, the EU is a huge trade bloc, and I don't underestimate that, and I don't take that for granted at all. But it's effectively also quite protectionist as well. And free trade is something that this country has in its blood. We're a free trading nation, a global trading nation, and I believe we will get a trade deal with the EU first. We will leave with a deal, and then we can look to the rest of the globe, the USA, Canada, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we will be a global trading nation. And I'm incredibly positive about the nation as a whole, but also those businesses in Hertford and Stortford that will have huge potential to export hugely highly qualitative, and you know, all these new industries that I'm talking about in the innovation corridor, those new growth industries. We are a centre of green technology. We will be a hub of green innovation and technology, and I think that leaves us with all to play for.
Thanks, Julie. Any other questions? We can't let Julie off with just one. Go ahead, Peter Blasco.
Yes, yes. Good evening again. The north-south divide has been talked about, and there seems to me, when you go there's an awful lot of talent which has been suppressed by the loss of steel and coal and all the rest of it. But the GDP isn't a thing that's helped measure their prosperity very well. So is there something in this that could help unlock the potential of the North and, of course, give it a boost at the same time?
Yes, and I think it's really important, and it's obviously a central plank of the government's aim. It was a central plank of our manifesto, and frankly, a reason why we won the election. And I have many colleagues in the red wall seats who never forget and never let anyone forget that they were elected partly to deliver Brexit, but also on that whole premise of levelling up this country, to spread wealth, to spread opportunity to potentially parts of the country that haven't not seen it before. And when I think about that, and I think about places like us, you know, and London, Eastern regions, Southeast regions, where we have amazing jobs, we have amazing opportunities, we have so much opportunity, but we also have really expensive housing. We also have some infrastructure which is really creaking. So actually spreading that wealth, spreading infrastructure, spreading growth, I think has a really huge potential benefit for areas like ours as well, because it relieves that pressure on places like ours, so that it just has, to me, it's a win-win. And yes, I mean, at the moment, you might go to some places outside of the M25 and the north, and actually quality of life out there is you know, really great. But there are also issues, and issues that, like you say, go back a long time, where we do need to rebalance the economy, because the service economy that I was talking about is very concentrated in a small part of the United Kingdom. And it really will be a hugely positive thing to spread that. And that's partly local democracy. And I know You know, that there are efforts to put more mayors and extend regional and local democracy like that, so that local mayors, like we've seen in Teesside, Ben Houchin in Teesside, who really focus on the local economy and really focus on getting money, not just government money, but business investment into their local economies. And I, for one, think that's a really positive thing. And I really, once this is over, I know that that's going to be a huge part of the focus of the government.
Thank you.
Thank you. Peter Latham, you need to unmute yourself.
I've unmuted myself, I think.
Yes, you are. We can hear you.
Yes, I'm very pleased, by the way, of the positive message that you put over. Very good, and we want more of that, surely. But I just, for a moment, look at the fact that this fighting COVID is often compared to the war. And I remember the last war and the optimism there was towards the end and after that, that terrible war we faced. Optimism of a type, in a way, that you're showing now. And unfortunately, the debt we'd run up, and we've run up a debt now to sustain ourselves through this COVID crisis, was a great inhibitor. And it was years before we managed to sort of free ourselves of that yoke of debt that inhibited our progress. Is it going to be different this time? I hope you can say yes.
Oh, I wish I could say yes. I think I'd be a fool to say that it's not going to be a huge issue. I mean, we are in a position, and I guess I think it's really important to recognise that we had a really resilient economy going into this. We really did. Thank goodness we did. And we had the ability to borrow at very low rates, which has helped us. And we have obviously borrowed. The Bank of England has issued huge amounts of debt. And there is no doubt that needs to be paid back. I'm a believer. I am optimistic, but I am also realistic that this is not easy and that there are consequences that will last for a very long time. But my view generally is we won't tax our way out of this. We will have to find ways of raising money like that. But that's we will grow. The way that we will do this is to grow our way out of that. And that's why I really have been going on at the Treasury, and I talked to Rishi Sunak, and I talked a lot about the Future Fund, because, as I say, I go back to the fact that the growth industries are going to be new industries. They might be industries, they might be companies that don't even exist as we sit here today. They are going to be companies where there is new science, there's new technology, there are new bright sparks who have thought of something that no one has thought about before. And so finding those and supporting those and providing the whole ecosystem, as I call it, to allow the innovators of the growth industries of tomorrow to grow, because that's how we're going to get through this. That's how we're going to recover and pay back that debt. But I don't, throughout my optimism, I don't underestimate how difficult that is going to be. I sit on the Treasury Select Committee, and for 2 sessions a week, for several hours, 2 times a week, I hear economists telling us the impacts of that, the trade-offs between health and wealth, and the impact that we're having on the economy. And I don't take it lightly at all. And you're right to raise it. It's a really important point, and it's not going to be easy, but I do believe we'll do it. And I do believe we'll do it by embracing the future, by embracing new industry and new innovation and new technology.
Thank you, Julie. Anne-Louise Briggs has got a question.
Hello. Yes, this evening on the news, they were talking about the generation of the 16 to 24-year-olds who are having a very difficult time. And the person presenting was fairly pessimistic about their future. How do you see them fitting into this new civil society and the growth that you predict for after the COVID?
Yeah, it's very, and so many people are very pessimistic, and I think they're right to raise the issues. But again, we have the power within our hands to make things work for young people. I mean, as I say, I speak to a lot of schools, and it is really, really worrying when, you know, kids have not even been able to sit their own exams. They've given, you know, been awarded grades, whether they, I mean, it's better than the algorithm, don't get me wrong, but, you know, that whether they feel they deserve that, even the fact that they worked so hard and didn't get to actually prove themselves in an exam room. I wouldn't underestimate how many young people talk to me about that. And yes, you know, how they're going to pay through university, what their university experience is going to be like, and what jobs are going to be there at the end of them, and whether they will be able to afford to buy a house ever. So I would say there's no silver bullet to those issues, but it's really, really important to focus on them. Just for instance, I sat on a panel a few weeks ago where we were talking about the deposit problem that young people have, that actually they're paying in rent, they're paying quite a lot of money in rent, which they could be paying in mortgage, they could potentially buy their own home, but they don't have their deposits. And the government has said they're going to come up with schemes to support young people in getting deposits and shared ownership and so on, and expanding that. And of course, building more homes so that young people have that potential security. And in terms of jobs, I do believe there will be a swift recovery, and it's just really important that we continue, and the government has, I'm not here just to be a cheerleader for the government, but the government has put in place many apprenticeship schemes, the Kickstart scheme, and the skills and enterprise schemes, which are focused on young people and making sure that they do not leave education, whether it's academic education or apprenticeships, on the job education experience, to make sure that they have proper real jobs at the end of it. But it's something that's going to be really difficult. It's something we really need to work on very, 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 very seriously. I mean, I had a jobs and apprenticeships fair. I could only do it online a few weeks ago, but there are jobs out there still, and there will be. But we need to make sure young people have the skills to go into the new technologies and the growth industries that I'm talking about, and that so that they can see a path to almost like what their parents have and had. So that they do feel they've got a stake in our economy, they've got a stake in our society. And I think it's easy to be negative, but I think if we work hard and we focus on it, we can deliver for young people.
Thank you, Julie. Colin George has got a question.
Yeah. Julie, in your year as an MP, have you identified some social issues that you think might inhibit some of the social cohesion that you're obviously hoping is going to be reinforced in the period post-COVID? I mean, as a Rotary Club, that's partly or mainly about what we're about, is actually looking to see what social needs we might make some contribution to resolving. Any guidance you have would be helpful. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Part of what I'm looking at with social impact bonds are exactly for that reason. For identifying and trying to find a way that we can deliver the best value, but crucially the best targeted and the best effective services for those people that could be missed, and which historically have been missed, actually. And I'm thinking about disabled people, for example. I'm thinking about kids and adults with special educational needs, for example. How can we tailor apprenticeships which take account of those particular needs and wider disabilities? And what services and what barriers are there, for example, for what used to be called the that we used to, under David Cameron, we categorised as the Troubled Families Initiative, which is families who have lots of different barriers, and that you might, they need multi-intervention. So they might have problems with housing, mental illness and or addictions, and just such troubled backgrounds. How do you remove multi-barriers to their full participation in society? So what I'm doing in social impact bonds is all focused on exactly that type of issue. And I think one of the things we have learned is actually the local element of this cannot be underestimated. National programmes, are often so much a one-size-fits-all solution, whereas if we build local plans, local initiatives, properly funded, absolutely focused on what needs are in our local communities, I think we can reach those hard-to-reach elements of society that I think have often been overlooked for too long. And I think you're right. I think that's exactly what Rotary is about. And I think that kind of thinking is exactly the kind of area where I'm trying to match what I'm thinking about in social delivery with what Rotary does so well locally as well. I hope that makes sense. I hope I've answered that question.
Thanks, Julie. Can I just ask a question about impact bonds? I totally agree with you that it is a fantastic way forward. And there are lots of investment companies ready to stand behind them. What I'm not picking up is government there, because government has a part to play. If we're going to be delivering social services at home and overseas, it needs government to stand behind them. Is government ready to start talking about this?
You've hit the nail on the head, Gordon, and that's exactly the space that I'm trying to address. That's the gap that I'm trying to address. So social impact bonds are not new, as you recognise. They've been used to deliver probation services in Essex. They've been delivering some disability services in Cumbria. There are small, patchy little examples of them. And what I'm trying to do is to look at those, and I'm doing a lot of work, my whole team's doing a lot of work, and with the think tank, is to identify what made which ones successful, what was successful about them, what were the problems. This is not supposed to be a puff piece for them. It's supposed to be a very, very brutal assessment of what's good about them, what's bad about them. If we come up with a conclusion they just don't work, I don't think that will be, because I'm convinced they will work. But how do we make them work? If they work, how do we make them work? And absolutely, how does the government stand behind them? How do we scale them up? How do we get enough investment to make them worthwhile, to both attract the businesses and the philanthropic trend that we need, that I'm hoping that it will attract, but also to get government to stand by them as well, to give them the scale and the efficiency and the confidence that will make them work on a bigger scale. It's all about the scaling up and getting it right.
Thanks, Julie. Peter, I think you have a question.
Yeah, I just wonder whether you think following COVID there will be a change in the balance between the previously strong economic countries and those which were upcoming but haven't been so badly affected by COVID. So, I mean, if you look at America and Western Europe and other countries that have been in the forefront of development, whilst China and South Korea and perhaps Taipei and people like that, do you think after COVID there will be a change in the sort of global balance between East and West effectively, whereby the East will become even more powerful than they appear to have been pre-COVID, mainly because they haven't had to dig so deep, borrow so much, they haven't got such strong commitment towards helping their population try and get through the problem.
Yeah, I mean, you hit upon huge geopolitical issues there, and you're quite right. They existed before, and yes, in many ways they've been exacerbated by the COVID crisis. You know, countries like Russia and China, yeah, they haven't got the best interests of their people at heart. Let's you know, be absolutely clear about it. And when we look at Chinese investment in Africa, for example, the Belt and Road and strategy, it's very, very effective, but it's not got the interests of the African people at heart. So I don't think we won't be emulating them. We can't copy them. We can't go down that road, and we wouldn't want to. But we certainly need to be very cognizant of what they're doing, what their aims are, and how brutally they will seek to achieve their aims. Our path is a different one. You're quite right to identify the differences, and I go back to that my belief in free trade. That is the way to level up, in a way. You know, we trade, and one thing that I have always believed about the EU, it talked a great game about, you know, countries that trade together don't you know, fight with each other, and that's true, and that was the origins of it. But it became a much more inward-looking protectionist entity. And I believe in global Britain. It sounds like a cheap slogan, and it's not supposed to be, because I think it has real economic impacts and implications, and it has political implications as well. And I do believe that trading nations are prosperous nations, and the more we trade with each other, with Africa and with nations, even those ones that we don't have to agree with their politics all the time. Again, most countries, most governments are essentially pragmatic, and they will do what's best for their countries, which is usually having a thriving economy, and that free trade and sensible politics, pragmatic politics, will assist us in that levelling up agenda, which does have implications beyond the UK, but it's of the UK and Asia and its relationships with North America and the Pacific nations and the Eastern nations and Africa, and countries that are hugely ambitious. They're hugely growing countries who will overtake us and many of the major economies very, very soon.
Right, one last question for Julie. Robert Muir, you need to unmute yourself, Robert. There we go.
Yeah. Hi, Julie. As Rotary, we're a global organisation, and both as a club and a district, we work extensively with other clubs and districts in the third world. We've noticed recently that it has now been merged with the Foreign Office, and as such, has it just become just a small part of the Foreign Office? And are we ultimately to expect there's going to be less aid available in the future by virtue of that?
I'm glad you mentioned that. I did ask a question of the Foreign Secretary in the Chamber a month or two about this, just when it was announced. And the answer was unequivocal, that our aid contributions are set in law. We have absolutely no plans to change that. Our aid has a function, 0.7% of GDP, and that is what it will stay, which is a huge, I think it's a totemic part of what we as a government and we as a nation are about. I certainly would not support any change in that. I think it's morally an imperative, and I think it's economically sensible, it's pragmatic, because, as I say, we are a shrinking world in so many ways. The last thing we want to do is to retreat into our island and pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist. We have a moral obligation, and I think it's one of the most positive things about our nation and what the last Conservative government, or the David Cameron government, did, and I think there's a lot of support for that. In terms of the merger, I am assured that it is a very practical thing, that actually working those two parts, the aid and the foreign policy. There are so many ways of aligning those and leveraging benefits off of those for ourselves as a nation, but also our partner countries and those countries that we want to work with and that we want to assist. I think it's one of those things we just need to keep an eye on, because I'm hearing and I believe that the objective is very positive, that it's not supposed to be a retrograde step. It's not a step backwards when it comes to our commitment to aid and our place in the global Britain. But I think we need to, we need to be pragmatic about it, and we need to keep an eye on it, because it's really important, certainly important to me, and I think it's a totemic signal to the rest of the world about what this country stands for and where it wants to be in the world, its place in the world.
There are some confusing messages coming out from the Foreign Office and the old DFID. There seems to be a lack of clarity at this point in time what direction they're moving in.
Yeah, and I do think it's really important to keep an eye on it, because I'm hoping that's changed, that maybe some of the mixed messages is because change is happening. But you're right, we need to, and as I say, we need to keep an eye on it, because I don't want to see that commitment diluted. And I do believe there's a big groundswell of people who feel like me in the party and in Parliament.
I think there might be a challenge that you and I could work together on, Julie.
I'd be delighted to work with you and certainly lots of like-minded people. Delighted to do that. And as I say, I've raised it in the chamber, and I will raise it again in the chamber, because it's really important.
Okay, thank you. One last question from Irene Hinshelwood.
Julie, I'm very interested in what you were saying about the strength of the country going forward. Do you think it's detrimental what's happening at the moment, with partly driven by COVID and the financing and the lockdowns being fragmented around the country? I mean, I'm a unionist at heart. I think the strength of this country is that we all pull together. But I'm slightly worried about where we'll be after COVID with the divisions that seem to be going on at the moment.
I think you put your finger on a really interesting and important point. Clearly, the nationalist agenda has benefited from an ability to differentiate different governments and to say we're doing better, we're doing this and you're not. So when Scotland has 5 tiers because we have 4, for example, it's a silly example, but I think it speaks to a desire to speak to their own nation and to say that we're different, we're our own nation and we're different and we can do things better. Now, I think it is presenting a huge challenge to us, and I think we need to be very mindful of that. And obviously there are elections in Scotland, for example, next year, and Douglas Ross is actually speaking to a lot of us next week about what he's got in mind. And he's already differentiating himself. You may notice in what he says, he is differentiating himself from the UK government, from the Westminster Parliament, almost to speak to the domestic audience in Scotland. But what that cannot do is to put more barriers in the way of the union. I'm like you, I'm an absolute unionist and I believe in the union. And what I think we must do is focus on the failings of the national governments, which are obsessed with differentiating themselves for England and fighting this phony war between different parliaments, and actually put a spotlight on, for example, the Scottish government, where the attainment gap, I don't know if you saw Andrew Neil talk about it just very recently, absolutely excoriated the SNP spokesman by talking about the SNP's domestic failures, effectively, that the attainment gap in Scotland has got bigger. Whilst Nicola Sturgeon is obsessed about getting one up on the UK, the Westminster Parliament, domestically we need to highlight the failures of those governments, the Labour government in Wales, the SNP in Scotland. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to move that agenda. During COVID, it's very difficult because there's a big platform given to these people to differentiate themselves, to give themselves a platform as an independent kind of government. When we look back, when we look to recover, I think we must make it very clear that we're recovering as a UK, as a United Kingdom, and then start to focus again on the failings of those individual governments and those people that would seek to divide us. But it's not easy. Again, none of these, you put your finger on really, really important big issues, and it's not easy. But again, I know that the government is cognizant. It realises the dangers that have faced us, and I hope it will rise. We will all rise to that challenge, because the union's really, really fundamental to again, who we are as a nation, the nation we are.
Thank you very much, Julie. There's a message on the chat box from Russell Brown, who's from Rotary in Beijing, China, saying, congratulating you on a very interesting presentation.
Oh, well, that's very kind of him. Thank you. Well, lovely to go to Beijing. We're zooming all the way to Beijing. That's amazing. Just shows you some of the benefits of this technology.
Absolutely. Anyway, thank you, Julie. And it's so refreshing for a politician to actually answer the questions that are asked. Our next talk will be on the 24th of November, and our speaker will be Ed Anthony, Director of Mental Wellbeing in Schools. And Ed will be talking about developing resilience and mental well-being in year 6 in school. I think it's a very important part of the recovery that Julie's been talking about. So I look forward to you joining us on that. So that just leaves me with one role, which is to wish you all, thank you all for joining us, and for a very special evening, I've got to say. And it leaves me to invite you all to join me to toast the Queen, Rotary, and peace and health the world over. The Queen and Rotary.
The Queen and the Rotary. Thank you so much, Gordon, and thank you to everyone. It's a real privilege to share this with you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julie.
Thank you.